Before we start the podcast, I have a very important message. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Anchor is an app, and it's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify and Apple Podcast and many more platforms. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Now, let's begin the podcast. Hi, welcome to the 7th episode of the Thoughts with Lakshman podcast. Just in case you haven't watched any of the previous episodes of my podcast, I'll quickly mention what I've discussed. I'll give you some background on what I've discussed in previous episodes, and then we'll get into this episode. In general, this podcast is really focused on German culture. And then within German culture, I explore different aspects with it. And then I also look at German history with philosophers, with individuals, and then also with just German history. So in the first episode of my podcast, I explored East German nostalgia after the Berlin Wall was taken down, just briefly. Obviously, the Berlin Wall separated East and West Germany, and East Germany was led by communists, by socialists, and there were products that existed in the East German market that would not have survived in the capitalist market of West Germany. And basically, after the wall was taken down, a number of products like Spreewald pickles, there was mustards, there was some wines that people loved in East Germany because they become accustomed to it. And those brands survived because of the socialist market. They didn't survive in the capitalist market, so those products died out. So the nostalgia, nostalgia's not a word, it's nostalgia, but they call it nostalgia because it's East Germany. It's basically nostalgia from East Germany. But basically the podcast explores that cultural shift for people from East Germany, because obviously many people were ecstatic that the Berlin Wall was taken down, especially East Germans. But the fact that they did lose some of their favorite things was like a negative to it. So I explored that. In the second episode of my podcast, I looked at German immigration into the English colonies in the 18th and 19th century. Many people don't really know this, but German immigrants into the English colonies were the largest immigrant group. Irish were like the second, largest immigrant group other than English people, because obviously the colonists originally came from England. The first colony was in Jamestown in 1609. It expanded, then more Puritans came in from England for religious reasons, for economic reasons, but there were a lot of German immigrants that soon followed once word of the success of the English colonies spread across Europe. And those German immigrants came because they were upset with the failed democratic revolutions in Germany. And they knew that it spread across Europe that the colonies had established a democratic government. So it attracted many Germans. The political freedom attracted many Germans. And there were also a lot of economic opportunity. In the third episode of my podcast series, I then did kind of like a second up on the immigration, but I looked at an impact of German immigration into the English colonies. So for kindergarten is actually a German word. It's not even like translated into English, and that's the word kindergarten. It's straight German, kindergarten. Or in German, it would be pronounced Kindergarten. And Kinder means children. Garten means like an organized lecture. Garten doesn't mean school. Die Schule means school in German, but garden means organized lecture, as if you're talking to a group of people. So kindergarten was the German word for school for younger children. And when German immigrants came to the U.S., not to the U.S., wasn't known as the U.S. at the time, but when they migrated to the English colonies, children at the time did not work. Children at the time did not go to school, they worked. And what Germans instituted in their communities, Germans stick together when they immigrated to the English colonies. They set up their own schools, and they would send their children to school at a young age. They called it kindergarten. And obviously kindergarten is, I think it's age 6 today. And it spread, the idea of kindergarten spread because it was successful. Other colonists were noticing that the German immigrants, their kids were doing much better. They were becoming more successful, they were smarter, they were doing better. And they looked at what was different, and it wasn't really that much different other than the fact that Germans were sending their kids to school at a much younger age. So then the concept of kindergarten, which was originally a German concept, became widespread in the colonies. Then it expanded and expanded, and today we have kindergarten, and we can probably credit the Germans for that. In the 4th episode of my podcast, I discussed the role of soccer in German culture. I play soccer. I love soccer. It's probably my favorite sport to watch. And for those of you that don't know, Germany is a soccer power in the world. They won the World Cup in 2014. They have one of the most, the strongest domestic leagues, generates the second most revenue in the world. They have some of the world's highest paid and most recognizable players. And the more important, I talked about a bit of the soccer side of soccer in Germany, but then I also looked at, how it brings together so many Germans. Like, for example, over 80% of Germans, like in Germany, over 80% of Germans during the World Cup, for the semifinal, I believe it was 83%, and then for the final, 87%. So 87% of Germans watched the final, which is crazy if you think about it. Like, if 87% of Americans watched the Super Bowl, that would be like it'd be like 290 million out of 327. I believe the Super Bowl, I'm going to see right now, but just to give you a comparison, yeah, so the Super Bowl had 100 million viewers, which compared to Germany with the World Cup, 100 million viewers for the Super Bowl, that's less than 1/3 of the U.S. population. Whereas Germany, you have around 87% of people watching the World Cup. So it just shows, right? Because the Super Bowl is such a massive event in the U.S. Now, the World Cup semifinal and the final, where Germany won both, they played in both, 87% of Germans watched that. So that's crazy. So it just shows how soccer brings Germans together, how important soccer is to German culture. And it's also like a nationalistic thing, too, because people feel proud seeing their country do so well to dominate in soccer. And it also brings Germans together, regardless of where they're from, regardless of their circumstances. It brings a lot of people together, and that's a beautiful thing about soccer. Because the only thing that matters is how good you are on the pitch. There's nothing else that goes into it. It's equal I guess the opportunity for some, but at the end of the day, as long as you're on the pitch, everything else goes out the window. So, so that was an interesting podcast. And then the 5th episode, I did a German philosopher, Karl Marx. People know Karl Marx today because of Marxism, which were his socialist ideas, his ideas, his economic policies. I didn't just focus on that. I looked through his life, and I focused on how its early years, because he grew up not very well. He grew up actually middle class, but his life experiences really impacted his views. And my thesis for the podcast, was that if Karl Marx had not grown up the way he grew up, that he would not have had the views that he had. And I strongly believe that, because even though he was a member of the middle class, even though he grew up relatively affluent, he experienced a lot of really unique things that really shaped his views. I don't want to spoil it, but that's an interesting podcast too. And then I also looked at the impact of Marx's ideas on the Russian Revolution and American politics today. And then in the sixth and most recent episode of the podcast, I did something a little different than the other episodes. I did an episode on the German Bundesliga. I looked at some major stories, the financial situation right now with COVID, possible transfer activity for the summer. Yeah, that's what I focused on there. It was probably the longest podcast so far, but yeah, it's a more specific topic. So if you're not interested, that's fine. But remember that if, like, let's say one of those topics interested you, my podcast isn't linked in any way, shape, or form. So if you want to watch episode 4, that's go ahead. You don't need to watch episode 3 for episode 4 to make sense. So each episode's a completely different topic. So yeah, and yeah, let's just get started with this episode. So today we're going to be discussing Immanuel Kant, his philosophies. He's a German philosopher. We're going to be looking at his philosophies, how his life impacted his philosophy, so a similar format to the Karl Marx episode, and then the impact of his philosophies. So just a background on Immanuel Kant. And by the way, it's spelled with an I. It's Immanuel. A lot of people don't know that. And Kant is with a K, so Kant. So Immanuel Kant, he was a German philosopher during the Enlightenment era. Now, the Enlightenment era, for those of you that don't know, it was an influx of creativity, of artistic expression, of literature, all of those things. Really just, I guess you could call all of those things forms of art, but just an influx of creative expression in the late 18th century. That includes writing, that includes artwork, that includes architecture, that everything. So that was the Enlightenment. People had new ideas, they thought for themselves, and so they created more, there was more artistic expression, and yeah. And his Immanuel Kant now, he's his best known work, and if you probably might know this, but I didn't know this before the podcast. It's called The Critique of Pure Reason, and I'm not going to get into it right now, but that's a bit of a foreshadowing of what his philosophy is focused on. So Immanuel Kant, he worked as a tutor, and he was a tutor relating to science for a few years, and he published several science papers, including general natural history, the theory of the heavens. He also spent time as a lecturer. So that's part of the stuff that we're going to. I think I made a format, but yeah, that's part of what we're going to be going over. So let's just start off with his early life. So Kant was the fourth of 9 children. His father was a harness maker. Later in his life, Immanuel Kant, he changed his name to Canto, and a lot of people don't know this, but because of German language, and it kind of makes sense to me now. It was fascinating when I first read it, but with German spelling practices, it made more sense for his last name to be Canto, because with 2 T's, and Canto is spelled Kntto, it fit in with German pronunciation better, because Kant doesn't really sound very German. It's more like his last name sounds more French. So he changed the spelling of his last name to make it sound a bit more German and to make it fit German spelling practices. Just an interesting fact. So his parents were very religious. Also, that influenced Kant. And at the time, people who were more religious believed, and this is a general thing, you could see this in the English colonies too, in the 18th century. People who were religious tended to focus on education for their children more so than parents who were not so religious. And it has nothing to do with religious people are more educated and are smarter, and that's why they're sending the kids. No, I mean, that could be the case, but the reason behind it is that at the time, people didn't go to school to get like an ordinary job. People went to school, people went to school and then they went to college to become ministers in churches. And at the time, colleges served to produce the next generation of ministers. So people who weren't that religious, they didn't focus that much in school because school existed at the time in the 18th century. And remember, the 18th century means the 1700s. So school existed during the 1700s to educate the next generation of ministers. And for those people that weren't really that religious, it made more sense for their children to help work, to help farm, to help work, and make them make more money. So Kant, and this is an important part of this little point, while it might not seem that significant, it's really important because Kant had not received such an advanced education, which he did. He received a really, really great education for the time period. We have no clue whether he would have had the same philosophies, and he likely wouldn't have. So yeah, his parents were very religious. Their pastor arranged for Kant's education. Kant studied Latin in school. He enrolled at the University of Königsberg. He studied theology, but he was very attracted to math and physics. Now, Kant's father died after 6 years. Kant was still in university. So 6 years after he first enrolled, he was still in university. And he had to leave university after his father died, and he worked as a tutor to help provide for his family, as I mentioned earlier, as a tutor. And while he worked as a tutor, he published several papers that dealt with the scientific questions, exploring the middle ground between rationalism and empiricism. And so let's just go over what both of those terms are, in case you're not. Rationalism is more simple. Rationalism is really, you can be described as a rational thinker. Rationalism is, the formal definition would be belief or theory that opinions and actions should be based on reason and knowledge rather than on religious beliefs or emotional response. So that's rationalism. So that's why you can see, right, that people are called rational thinkers, rational people. Some people are rational, some people are irrational. Like, for example, if you're angry that something just happened and then you I don't know, you break your pencil, you snap your pencil in half. That's not really rational. You're acting emotionally. So, um, but then empiricism, that's the theory that all knowledge is derived from a sense experience. So it's with it emphasizes personal experience. It's basically it was stimulated during the 17th and 18th centuries, and it's supported by the rise of, I guess you could say, experimental science. And the reason that experimental science supports it is that it's basically, this theory is basically arguing that the best learning almost is from experience in a way. You could think of it like that. I mean, it emphasizes almost the roles of your own evidence in the formation of ideas rather than, innate ideas or traditions. Um, so I guess you could say it is rational in a way, but there are differences between rationalism and empiricism, and Kant looked to expose those. So Kant, like I said earlier, back to his life. So he worked as a private tutor. Now, we've already seen a couple impacts of his life. The first impact is his parents being religious. That impacted to him receiving an education. So that's an interesting impact. Now, Kant, after earning enough for his family to be um, stable, to be healthy financially, he returned to university in 1755. And in that year, he also received his doctorate of philosophy. And then for the next 15 years, up until 1770, he worked as a lecturer and tutor. And he also wrote major works on philosophy. We're going to get into some of those works in a bit. And after those 15 years, in about 1770, he also became a full-time professor at the University of Königsberg, and he taught logic. So in 1781, and by the way, Kant, so he published The Critique of Pure Reason. Now, Kant had been working on this for nearly a decade. He chipped at it over nearly a decade, and it's enormous. It's an enormous work, and it's probably the most important. It was considered super influential at the time, and it still is. It's not as much in the U.S., but in Europe, it's a massive, massive work. And in his book, I guess you could call it a book. Yeah, it is a book, and it's really just a really long paper that's in a book. And Kant is basically he's seeking to determine in his book the limits and I guess scope of like metaphysics almost. It's basically in general to respect all knowledge, after which it may be independent, and then it's emphasizing knowledge rather than experience in a way. And it also focuses on the reason. And pure reason is reasoning without experience. So it's back to the empiricism and rationalism debate, right? Because rationalism, thinking with logic. Empiricism is similar, but you're basing your logic off your own experiences. So Kant discusses pure reason, and that pure reason Kant refers to reasoning without experience. And he argues that our reasoning has to be regulated, because bad metaphysics is rooted in unregulated reasoning. So, for example, like Kant did not believe in God. I guess I shouldn't talk about this, but there's interest. Kant does not believe in like superstitions, for example. Superstitions are a good example. So Superstitions, a lot of people believe in superstitions. A lot of people. They're fearful of superstitions. Before they have a big test or something, they're going to do something, and they're scared that if they don't do something, they're not going to do good. Even though it's not scientifically proven, right? It's reasoning without any knowledge. But it's not reasoning without experience. So that's what Kant's trying to prove, because he's basically saying that, okay, pure reason is not always right. Like, let's say, for example, you touch a hot, stove. That's reasoning with experience. You learn, okay, I touch a hot stove, I burn my hand, that hurts. I'm not going to do that again. That's reasoning with experience. So sometimes it could be right. So that's empiricism. That's when it's right. And rationalism is just saying, you know what? I know that if I touch a hot stove, it's not going to work out. It's going to hurt me. I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to think logically. It's not a good idea. But what Kant is saying is that, okay, empiricism can also be wrong. For example, superstitions, reasoning without, it's reasoning it's reasoning with experience. That's the reason that, so superstitions, for example, let's say every time before you have a big test, I don't know, you use the same pencil, okay? You have a lucky pencil, you use the same pencil. Or you use the same type of pencil, okay? Because you might lose a pencil. And that's what Kant's describing as bad metaphysics. Because bad metaphysics is rooted in unregulated reason. That's unregulated reason. Superstitions are an example of unregulated reason. And the bad metaphysics is using the same pencil, same brand of pencil. Because it's reasoning with experience, which is empiricism, but Kant is saying that's stupid, right? That's wrong. Superstitions are wrong, even though it follows empiricism logic perfectly. So that's what Kant's really arguing. And it's a 856 page book. And I hope that I tried to explain it. I spent some time reading so I could try and get it. I hope you understood, but it's it's very interesting. So just to go over clearly, because I think I might have confused something, and I want to make sure, because this is interesting. So empiricism versus rationalism, that's the main topic of the book. Rationalism, actions by logic. Empiricism, actions by experience. Empiricism can be right. You touch a stove, you burn your hand, it hurts. That's an action by experience. I'm not going to do that again because I experienced it and it didn't work out for me. Rationalism would just be thinking, you know what, that's hot. It's not a good idea for me to touch it. I'm not going to touch it. That's rationalism. So they can both be right. But Kant's arguing that empiricism can also be wrong. And he's using superstitions as an example. Because let's say and I'm using superstitions. Kant goes into other more controversial examples. I'm not going to talk about those, but I thought superstitions was a good replacement example. So, for example, you take a test, use the same pencil, same brand of pencil before every test, and you're doing well. That's a superstition that, like, you're thinking that. Like, let's say you have a superstition. I'm going to use the same brand of pencil before every test, and you do well over the course of the year. You got A's, right? That's reasoning with experience. Okay, your reasoning is, oh, my pencil, I have a superstition, I got to use this pencil, and your experience is, wow, I'm doing good with it, it's working. That's your superstition. But Kant's arguing that's stupid, even though that follows empiricism logic perfectly. It's wrong. That's what Kant's basically arguing, and he's doing it with more controversial examples with, like, God, whether God exists or not. So it's an interesting book. It's called The Critique of Pure Reason. It's available on Amazon. It's 856 pages. There's an English edition. There's a German edition. So, it was translated from German. The original language was German. But, yeah, it's an interesting read. After Kant published The Critique of Pure Reason, Kant focused on ethics, philosophical study of moral actions. He proposed a sort of moral law, I guess you could call it. It was called the categorical imperative. And he basically stated that morality is derived, or it comes from, rationality and all moral judgments are rationally supported. So basically what he's saying is what is right, and what is wrong, and there's no gray area. The fact that you're thinking about it being in a gray area means that it's wrong. And human beings are obligated to follow this imperative or this reasoning, this logic set of reasoning, unconditionally if they want to be moral. Kant isn't as well known for that, so I'm not going to go deep into it, but it's an interesting thought. I agree with it to an extent that if you're thinking about whether something is a good thing for you to do, it's probably not, because the fact that you have to think about it, right? If you have to think that something's a morally good thing for you to do. Back to the critique of pure reason, because it's such a massive part of what Kant's known for. It received little attention at the time, actually, partly because people weren't really that educated at the time to keep up with Kant. Not many people could really appreciate the book for what it was. Kant continued to refine his theories in a series of essays. He published The Critique of Practical Reasoning, The Critique of Judgment. He continued to write on philosophy until his death. He actually he lived a very long life for someone in the 18th century. He died in 1804 at age 80. But yeah, so that brings us to the end of the podcast today. Just to recap briefly, Kant is one of the most influential philosophers in the history of Western philosophy. He contributed heavily to metaphysics, ethics, rationalism, empiricism, and moral values, pure reasoning. So Kant has had truly a profound impact on the philosophical community and the movement that followed him too. I'm thinking about, I might do this, depending on how many topics I have for podcasts, I'll consider doing this, but I want to focus on some philosophers that created their beliefs, or they were influenced by their beliefs because of people like Immanuel Kant and Karl Marx. So that's an idea I have for a podcast. But thank you for listening in. As always, if you like the podcast, drop it a like rating, subscribe. Thank you, and I hope you listen to many more podcasts in the future. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and goodbye.